Life has a funny way of turning ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. For Mai, a young girl who called the back alley of New York's fanciest restaurant her temporary home, that moment came on a chilly autumn evening when the city lights were just starting to twinkle. She wasn't always homeless. Just 6 months ago, she had a normal life, a warm bed, and a family. But fate had other plans when her grandmother, her only living relative, passed away. With no one to turn to and the foster system looking more frightening than the streets, Mai chose to disappear into the concrete jungle of Manhattan. The back alley of Le Cirque became her unlikely sanctuary. It wasn't much, but it had everything she needed to survive. A dry spot under the ventilation outlet that kept her warm, and most importantly, a small window through which she could watch the kitchen staff prepare meals for the city's wealthiest people. Mai didn't mind being invisible. In fact, it had become her superpower. When you're invisible, people don't notice you watching them. They don't hide their secrets. They don't wear their fake smiles. They just exist, raw and real, never knowing they have an audience. That's why, on this particular evening, she was probably the only person who noticed something wasn't quite right. The kitchen was buzzing with its usual energy, chefs calling out orders, the clinking of expensive china, the sizzle of perfectly seared steaks. But there was something else, something that made Mai's spine tingle with unease. A woman had entered through the service entrance, definitely not a staff member. Everything about her screamed money, from her perfectly styled hair to her designer dress that probably cost more than what most people made in a month. But it was her eyes that caught Mai's attention. Cold, calculating, like a snake sizing up its prey. Mai pressed herself closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass slightly. The woman was talking to one of the kitchen staff, a newer guy Mai had only seen around for the past couple of weeks. Their conversation seemed casual enough, but their body language told a different story. They were too stiff, too aware of their surroundings. Then it happened, so quick that if Mai had blinked, she would have missed it. The woman slipped something to the kitchen worker, a small vial, no bigger than her pinky finger, along with a thick envelope that disappeared into his pocket faster than a street magician's coin trick. The woman's diamond wedding ring caught the fluorescent kitchen light as she turned to leave, and Mai's heart skipped a beat. She knew that face. It was plastered all over the magazines in the convenience store where she sometimes sought shelter from the rain. Mrs. Hamilton, wife of the tech genius who was always in the news for his groundbreaking inventions. Mai felt her hands getting clammy despite the cool air. In her months on the street, she'd seen plenty of shady dealings, drug exchanges, stolen goods changing hands, money being passed under tables. But something about this felt different, more dangerous. The vial, the secretive exchange, the way Mrs. Hamilton's eyes had darted around. It all added up to something sinister. As Mrs. Hamilton's clicking heels faded away and the kitchen returned to its normal rhythm, Mai huddled deeper into her worn jacket. The weight of what she'd witnessed settled heavy on her shoulders. She might be just a homeless kid that nobody would believe, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed the beginning of something terrible. Little did she know, her next decision would not only change her life forever, but would also expose a deadly plot that had been years in the making. Sometimes the most important witnesses are the ones society has forgotten how to see. 3 days had passed since Mai witnessed that strange exchange in the kitchen, but she couldn't get it out of her mind. She barely slept, spending her nights trying to piece together what it might mean. The local newspaper she fished out of a recycling bin that morning finally gave her the missing piece of the puzzle. Tech pioneer James Hamilton to celebrate revolutionary AI breakthrough at Le Cirque, the headline announced. Mai's hands trembled as she read the article, her fingertips smudging the newsprint. The dinner was scheduled for tonight. The autumn wind picked up, scattering leaves across the alley as Mai paced back and forth. She'd memorized Mr. Hamilton's face from the newspaper photo, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, slightly messy gray hair that suggested he spent more time inventing things than looking in mirrors. He seemed like somebody's favorite uncle, not the billionaire genius the papers described. As evening approached, the kitchen's energy shifted into high gear. Mai watched through her window as staff members rushed around, polishing silverware and arranging flowers. The new guy, the one who'd taken the vial, was there too, working at the dessert station. Something about his movements seemed off, too careful, too measured. May's stomach growled, reminding her it had been almost a day since her last proper meal. Usually, one of the kind-hearted kitchen staff would leave some leftover bread or soup by the back door, but today everyone was too busy with the special event. She ignored her hunger, focusing instead on watching the dessert station like a hawk. The sun had set when the sleek black cars started arriving. Maid pressed her face against the glass, breath fogging up the window as she watched the city's elite step into the restaurant. Ladies in sparkly dresses, men in expensive suits, they all looked like characters from those movies she used to watch with her grandmother. Then she saw him, Mr. Hamilton, walking in through the front entrance. He looked exactly like his photo, except his smile seemed sadder in person. May noticed he was alone. Mrs. Hamilton, the woman from the other night, was nowhere to be seen. Time seemed to slow down as May watched the kitchen staff prepare the special dinner. Course after course went out to the private dining room. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the dessert chef reach into his pocket and pull out the vial she'd seen Mrs. Hamilton give him. With practiced movements, he added its contents to a single serving of what looked like chocolate mousse. No, 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 May whispered, her breath quickening. The dessert looked perfectly normal, elegant swirls of chocolate topped with gold leaf and fresh berries. Nobody would suspect anything was wrong with it. She watched in horror as the chef placed it on a silver tray, adding a small card that read Mr. Hamilton in fancy lettering. May's mind raced. What could she do? Who would believe a homeless teenager? Security would probably throw her out before she could say a word. But if she did nothing, the image of Mr. Hamilton's kind eyes flashed in her mind. Could she live with herself if something happened to him? The dessert was moving now, balanced carefully on a waiter's tray. May's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Time was running out. She had to make a decision. Without letting herself think about the consequences, May slipped away from her window and crept toward the kitchen's back door. She'd watched the staff enough times to know there was a brief moment between shift changes when the door was left unguarded. Inside, the kitchen was a blur of motion and noise. Steam rose from pots, orders were being called out, plates clanked against each other. Nobody noticed the small, dirty girl who'd slipped in. She was invisible, just like always. But not for long. Mai saw the waiter with the poisoned dessert heading toward the private dining room. Her feet started moving before her brain could tell them to stop. She darted between surprised kitchen staff, dodging outstretched hands that tried to grab her. "Hey, stop that girl!" Someone shouted, but Mai kept running. She could see the private dining room now. The waiter was just steps away from the door. 2 security guards moved to intercept her, but Mai had spent months learning how to slip past people who didn't want her around. She ducked under one guard's arm, slid past the other, and burst into the dining room. Time seemed to freeze. The city's most powerful people stared at her in shock, the dirty, breathless girl who'd just crashed their exclusive party. Mr. Hamilton had already picked up his spoon, the poisoned dessert sitting innocently before him. Mai knew she had just seconds before security dragged her away. She had to make them count. Opening her mouth, she prepared to shout the warning that would change everything, if anyone would believe her. 1 year later, Mai stood in front of a mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Gone was the scared girl from the alley behind La Sec. Instead, she saw a confident young woman in a simple but elegant blue dress, her hair neatly styled. Behind her reflection, she could see the bustling preparations for the opening ceremony of the Hamilton Youth Foundation. "Are you ready?" Mr. Hamilton asked, appearing in the doorway. He'd become more than just her guardian over the past year. He'd become family. "There are quite a few people out there waiting to hear your story." May took a deep breath, smoothing down her dress one last time. "Did you ever think, that night at the restaurant, that we'd end up here?" He chuckled, adjusting his tie. "You mean, did I think the homeless girl who saved my life would help us bring down an international crime ring, become my adopted daughter, and inspire a foundation to help other struggling kids? Can't say that was my first thought, no." The investigation had revealed more than anyone expected. Mrs. Hamilton's organization had been targeting brilliant minds across the globe for years, stealing innovations that could have changed the world for the better. Instead, they'd sold them to the highest bidders, not caring who got hurt in the process. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the power of simple human kindness. They hadn't counted on a homeless girl who still cared enough to help a stranger, even when the world had given her every reason not to care anymore. "The reporters want to talk about the dramatic parts," May said, walking with Mr. Hamilton toward the conference room. "The poison, the break-in, the arrest. But that's not really what matters, is it?" "What matters?" he asked, though his smile suggested he already knew her answer. "The little things. Paying attention. Caring about other people." Mai paused as they reached the door to the conference room. "Everything changed because I noticed something wrong and decided to speak up. Anyone could have done that. Everyone should do that." The conference room was packed with people, reporters, business leaders, and most importantly, the first group of teens who would benefit from the Foundation's programs. Mai saw herself in their faces, the worry, the hope, the determination to make something better of their lives. Mr. Hamilton stepped up to the podium first. "A year ago," he began, "I was a man who thought he had everything figured out. I ran a successful company, lived in a fancy penthouse, and believed I could solve any problem with enough money or technology." He smiled at Mai. "I was wrong about a lot of things. The most important things in life aren't the ones you can buy or invent. They're the connections we make with other people, the moments when we choose to help instead of look away." When it was May's turn to speak, she felt surprisingly calm. These weren't just strangers in fancy clothes. These were people who needed to hear what she had learned. "People often ask me how I spotted the poison plot," she began. "The truth is, living on the streets taught me to notice things others might miss. When you have nothing, you learn to pay attention to everything. But that's not the real lesson here." She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with the teens in the front row. "The real lesson is that everyone has the power to make a difference. You don't need money or status or special training. You just need to be willing to see what's happening around you and have the courage to speak up when something's wrong." May explained how the Foundation would work, providing not just shelter and education, but teaching young people to use their unique perspectives to help others. Some would train with security firms, turning their street smarts into professional skills. Others would work with community organizations, using their experiences to help more kids escape poverty. "The woman who tried to kill my father thought she was strong because she could trick people, because she could take what she wanted without caring who got hurt," Mai continued. "But real strength isn't about taking, it's about giving. It's about seeing someone in trouble and deciding to help, even when it's scary or inconvenient." She told them about the programs they were starting: self-defense classes, observation skills workshops, community outreach initiatives. "But most importantly," she said, "we're creating a network of people who look out for each other. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is for one person to pay attention at the right moment." The applause was thunderous when she finished, but Mai barely heard it. She was watching the faces of the teens in the front row, seeing hope replace doubt, seeing them sit up straighter, seeing them realize their own worth. Something softened in Mr. Hamilton's expression. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. Is she?" "She died 6 months ago," May said quietly. "That's why you know." She gestured vaguely at herself, at her worn clothes and unwashed hair. Mr. Hamilton nodded, understanding filling his eyes. "Well, we can't have my guardian angel sleeping in an alley, can we?" He smiled. A real smile, warm and kind, just like his photograph. "I think we have a lot to talk about, you and I. At first, let's get you something to eat. Something without poison, preferably." For the first time that evening, Mai felt tears welling up in her eyes. But they weren't tears of fear or shame. They were tears of hope. Sometimes the scariest decisions we make turn out to be the ones that change our lives for the better. As she followed Mr. Hamilton to a clean table with fresh food, Mai thought about how proud her grandmother would be. Not just because she'd saved someone's life, but because she found the courage to be seen when it mattered most. The next few days passed in a whirlwind that made May's head spin. She'd gone from sleeping in an alley to staying in a guest room in Mr. Hamilton's penthouse apartment, complete with a soft bed that felt like sleeping on clouds. The whole thing seemed like a dream, but the intense police investigation happening around her proved it was very real. Detective Chen, a sharp-eyed woman with reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, had been interviewing Mai for hours. They sat in Mr. Hamilton's home office, surrounded by screens showing security footage from the restaurant. Watch this part again, May said, pointing to the grainy video. See how she checks her ring before handing over the vial? She does this little twist with it, like she's making sure it's in place. The detective leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Good catch. Very good catch. She made another note in her already full notebook. Your attention to detail is remarkable. Most people wouldn't notice things like that. May shrugged, fidgeting with the sleeve of her new sweater, one of many clothes Mr. Hamilton's housekeeper had bought for her. When you live on the streets, you learn to notice everything. It's how you stay safe. The police had already confirmed May's warning about the poison. The lab tests showed it was something sophisticated and hard to detect. The kind of thing that would have looked like natural causes. But that was just the beginning of what they discovered. The money's gone, Mr. Hamilton announced, walking into the office with his phone in hand. His tie was loose, and his hair was messier than usual. He hadn't slept much since that night. She cleared out our joint accounts yesterday morning, nearly $50 million, transferred through a series of offshore banks. Detective Chen whistled softly. She'd been planning this for a while. Those kinds of transfers take preparation. But why? May asked, pulling her knees up to her chest in the comfortable office chair. She already had everything. The huge house, the fancy cars, all the money she could want. Mr. Hamilton sat down heavily in a nearby chair. It wasn't about the money, not really. My company was about to announce a breakthrough in cybersecurity, something that could protect against the most sophisticated hacking attempts. The kind of technology that's worth billions to the right buyers, or to the wrong ones. Or to whoever she's really working for, Detective Chen added, tapping her pen against her notebook. Mr. Hamilton, we need to talk about the background check you ran when you first met her. I did run one, he said, rubbing his temples. It was thorough, or at least I thought it was. Everything checked out perfectly. Too perfectly, maybe. May spoke up. Everyone turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks grow warm, but continued anyway. I mean, when I used to go to the library, I'd read mystery books. The best fakes are the ones where everything looks exactly right, like someone copied it all perfectly. Real life is usually messier. Detective Chen's eyes lit up. The girl's got good instincts. She turned back to her computer, typing rapidly. We've been digging deeper into your wife's past, Mr. Hamilton. The real Eleanor Crawford, the woman whose identity she stole, died in a car accident 6 years ago in a small town in Idaho. The records were altered so masterfully that it took our best analysts to spot the inconsistencies. May watched Mr. Hamilton's face as he absorbed this news. He looked tired and sad, but not completely surprised. I kept wondering, he said quietly, why she never wanted to visit her family. Why she had no old friends, no photos from her childhood. She always had perfect explanations, but deep down, something felt wrong. May finished for him. She knew that feeling. The nagging sense that something wasn't quite right, even if you couldn't explain why. A phone buzzed, and Detective Chen checked her messages. Her eyebrows shot up. We just got a hit on facial recognition at an airport in Dubai. Different hair, different name, but it's definitely her. She's not working alone, Mr. Hamilton said, standing up to pace the room. The complexity of this operation, the perfect identity theft, the coordinated bank transfers, this is something bigger. May watched him pace, remembering something else. The kitchen worker, the one who put in the poison. Did he say anything? He's talking now, Detective Chen replied. Claims he was just hired to do a job, didn't know the whole plan. But his bank records tell a different story. He's received similar payments before, linked to, well, let's just say your wife isn't his first employer. Suddenly, all the screens in the office lit up with an incoming video call. Mr. Hamilton's assistant appeared, looking worried. Sir, you need to see this. We've found irregularities in the company's network. Someone's been accessing sensitive files for months, all through your wife's security clearance. May watched as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The poison wasn't just about killing Mr. Hamilton, it was about creating chaos at his company. In the confusion after his death, who would notice files going missing or security protocols being changed? We need to move quickly, Detective Chen said, already reaching for her phone. If she's part of a larger organization that might have backup plans. Mr. Hamilton, we should get you to a secure location. No, he interrupted firmly. I'm not hiding. My company needs me right now, and running away won't solve anything. He looked at Mai with a slight smile. Besides, I apparently have a very observant guardian angel watching out for me. Mai felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. For the first time in months, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had a purpose. The investigation was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the most important eyes are the ones nobody notices, and the most powerful weapon isn't wealth or technology, but simply paying attention to the world around you. The truth has a way of coming out, piece by piece, like a puzzle slowly revealing its picture. As Mai sat in the FBI's New York office a week later, she watched that picture become clearer and darker than anyone had expected. Look at these, Agent Wong said, spreading photographs across the conference table. 3 different tech billionaires, 3 different cities, 3 mysterious deaths in the past 5 years. He pointed to each photo in turn. Heart attack, stroke, car accident, all ruled natural causes or accidents at the time. Mai leaned forward, studying the photos. Mr. Hamilton sat beside her, his face grim. The women in the photos all looked different at first glance. One blonde, one brunette, one redhead. But there was something about their faces, their bone structure. They're all her, Mai whispered, the realization hitting her like a cold wave. The same person, just changed. Exactly, Agent Wong nodded approvingly. Professional-grade disguises, perfect fake identities, and a pattern we've never seen before. She marries wealthy tech innovators, waits for the right moment, eliminates them, and vanishes with both money and company secrets. Mr. Hamilton picked up one of the photos, his hands slightly shaking. I recognize this man, Richard Chen. He was developing quantum encryption technology before he died. His company fell apart afterward, and all his research disappeared. The agent clicked a button, and new images appeared on the wall screen. Bank statements, travel records, and more photographs filled the display. We've traced money flowing through dozens of shell companies. Your wife, or whatever her real name is part of something bigger. A group that steals cutting-edge technology and sells it to the highest bidder. Mai thought about all those nights she'd spent watching through the kitchen window, how normal everything had seemed. But why get married? Why not just hack their computers or something? A small smile crossed Agent Wong's face. Good question. Mr. Hamilton, why don't you explain the security measures at your company? All our most sensitive data is kept on computers that aren't connected to the internet, Mr. Hamilton explained. The only way to access them is in person, with specific security clearance. Marriage, his voice caught slightly, marriage gave her that access, made her above suspicion. And the murders? Mai asked quietly. Coverage, Agent Wong replied. The chaos after a CEO's death provides the perfect opportunity to steal data without anyone noticing. Everyone's too busy with the funeral. The company leadership changes. The grieving widow. He shook his head. It's brilliantly evil. A young FBI analyst rushed into the room, laptop in hand. Sir, we found something. Those passport photos from Dubai? They led us to another identity. And another. It's like following a trail of breadcrumbs backward through time. Mai watched as more images appeared on the screen. The same woman, transforming again and again like a chameleon. Different names, different looks, but always targeting the same type of person, brilliant inventors with world-changing ideas. She's been doing this for over a decade, the analyst continued. We found her first victim, a software pioneer in Tokyo. She was different back then, less experienced, made mistakes, left traces. Mr. Hamilton stood up suddenly, walking to the window. The city sprawled out below, a maze of buildings and streets where anyone could disappear. All those people, he said softly. All that knowledge stolen, all those lives cut short. Mai got up and stood beside him. She might only be a teenager, but she understood loss. But she didn't get you, she reminded him. You're still here. You can stop them. He turned to look at her, something fierce and determined replacing the sadness in his eyes. You're right. And now we know what we're dealing with. Agent Wong cleared his throat. There's more. We found communications, encrypted, but our team cracked them. They're planning something bigger. Your wife's organization isn't just stealing technology anymore. They're gathering pieces of different innovations, trying to build something new, something dangerous. My security breakthrough, Mr. Hamilton said, realization dawning on his face. It wasn't just about stealing it. It was the final piece they needed. The analyst nodded. If they had succeeded, if they had gotten your technology, they could have created a system capable of bypassing any digital security on Earth. Banks, governments, nuclear facilities, nothing would be safe. Mai felt a chill run down her spine, remembering the cold look in Mrs. Hamilton's eyes that night in the kitchen. She hadn't just been plotting a murder, she'd been plotting to change the world, and not in a good way. But they didn't get it, Mai said firmly, looking up at Mr. Hamilton. Because sometimes the smallest things can change everything. Sometimes all it takes is one person paying attention at the right moment. Mr. Hamilton put a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil isn't another weapon at all, he said. It's simply being human enough to care about others, even when the world has given you every reason not to. Agent Wom gathered up the photographs, his expression serious but hopeful. We're closing in on their organization. Your wife's mistakes have given us more leads than she knows. But this isn't over yet. She's still out there, and she's not the type to give up easily. Let her come, Mr. Hamilton said quietly. This time, we'll be ready. And this time, he smiled at Mai, we know the value of keeping our eyes open. The truth about Mrs. Hamilton had been shocking, but Mai felt stronger knowing it. Sometimes understanding the darkness helps you appreciate the light even more. As she looked around at these adults working to untangle this complicated web of lies and crime, she realized that even the smallest person could make a difference in the biggest fights. All you needed was the courage to speak up when something wasn't right. 2 weeks had passed since the FBI's revelations, and life in Mr. Hamilton's penthouse had fallen into an uneasy routine. Security teams patrolled the building day and night. Mai had learned to live with the constant presence of bodyguards, but she never stopped watching, never stopped paying attention to the little details that others might miss. That's why she noticed something was wrong the moment she woke up that night. The air felt different somehow. The usual soft hum of the building's security systems was missing, and the digital clock by her bed was dark. Mai slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. The hallway was pitch black. No emergency lights, no gentle glow from the security cameras, nothing. Mai's heart started beating faster as she remembered what Mr. Hamilton had said about his home security system. It would only go completely dark if someone had deliberately shut it down. She heard voices downstairs, whispers, the soft scuff of shoes on marble floors. These weren't the familiar sounds of the security team. These footsteps were trying to be silent, trying not to be noticed. Mai crouched in the darkness, letting her eyes adjust. All those months of living on the streets had taught her how to move without being seen, how to become one with the shadows. She could hear Mr. Hamilton's voice in her head from their security briefings. If anything happens, get to the panic room. Don't try to be a hero. But the panic room was on the other side of the penthouse. To reach it, she'd have to cross open space, expose herself to whoever was down there. And what about Mr. Hamilton? Was he safe? A familiar voice drifted up from below, one that made Mai's blood run cold. The office is this way. Remember, we need those servers intact. The data is what matters. Mrs. Hamilton, she had come back. Mai's mind raced. The security team would have noticed the power cut, but it would take them time to reach the penthouse. Time Mr. Hamilton might not have. She had to do something, but what could one teenage girl do against professional criminals? Then she remembered something about the penthouse that she'd discovered during her first days here. Something about the way it was built. The ventilation system. The whole building had an elaborate network of air ducts, and Mai had mapped them all out of habit. Always knowing escape routes had been essential on the streets. Some of the ducts were big enough for a small person to crawl through, someone like her. Moving as quietly as she could, Mai made her way to the utility closet where she knew there was a vent access panel. She could hear more movement downstairs, at least 3 different sets of footsteps. They were being systematic, professional, checking each room as they went. The vent cover came off easily in her hands. Mai pulled herself up and into the duct, mentally reviewing the layout she'd memorized. The main office was 2 rooms over, connected by these same ducts. If she could get there first. The metal was cold against her palms as she crawled forward, trying to move silently. Every small sound seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Through the vent openings, she caught glimpses of the intruders below, dark clothes, professional equipment, and Mrs. Hamilton leading them with the same cold determination May remembered from the kitchen. She reached the vent above the office just as she heard the door open below. Mr. Hamilton was there, standing calmly behind his desk despite the gun pointed at him. Two men in black tactical gear flanked Mrs. Hamilton as she entered. "You should have died quietly," Mrs. Hamilton said, her voice carrying no emotion at all. "It would have been painless. Now we have to do this the hard way." "You don't have to do this at all," Mr. Hamilton replied steadily. "You must know you're never getting out of the building. Security is already on their way." Mrs. Hamilton smiled, that same cold smile that had haunted May's dreams. "By the time they get through our blocks, we'll be gone. And you'll be dead, just like all the others." May watched through the vent slats as one of the men moved to the computer servers while the other kept his gun trained on Mr. Hamilton. Mrs. Hamilton pulled out a small case, probably containing another dose of her untraceable poison. Time seemed to slow down as May considered her options. The vent cover below her was held on by 4 screws. The drop to the floor was about 12 feet. The intruders were focused on Mr. Hamilton and the servers. None of them was looking up. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is also the scariest thing you can imagine. May took a deep breath, grabbed the vent cover with both hands, and pushed with all her strength. The cover crashed down, hitting one of the armed men on the shoulder. In the same moment, May dropped from the vent, landing on the thick carpet and rolling just like she'd learned to do when jumping between buildings in the city. The surprise gave Mr. Hamilton the opening he needed. He dove behind his heavy desk as the other man's gun went off, the shot going wide. Mrs. Hamilton spun around, her calm facade cracking for the first time as she recognized May. "You," she snarled. "The little spade from the restaurant." May didn't waste time responding. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy crystal paperweight, and threw it at the light switch. The office plunged into darkness just as the sound of breaking glass filled the air. The backup security team had finally arrived, rappelling down from the roof. What followed was chaos, shouts, more breaking glass, the thud of boots on carpet. May dropped to the floor and crawled toward where she'd seen Mr. Hamilton take cover. She found him in the dark, gripping his phone which was now casting a dim light. "The servers," he whispered. "Did they?" "No time," May hissed, tucking his arm. "Emergency stairs. Now." They crawled together toward the office door as flashlights and laser sights cut through the darkness around them. May heard Mrs. Hamilton shouting orders, her voice finally showing real fear. The sound of running feet echoed through the penthouse as the security team flooded in. The emergency exit was just ahead. May reached for the door handle, but suddenly stopped. Something wasn't right. The handle was warm, too warm. "Wait," she whispered to Mr. Hamilton. "They've rigged it somehow. We need another way." Even in the chaos, even with death possibly seconds away, Mr. Hamilton managed a small smile. "Always watching," he said softly. "Always noticing what others miss. What would I do without you?" Before Mai could respond, a familiar voice called out from the darkness behind them. "FBI, nobody move." Agent 1 had arrived with reinforcements. As lights flooded the penthouse and agents swarmed in, May realized that once again, the smallest details had made the biggest difference. A warm door handle, a loose vent cover. The things most people never noticed could sometimes save lives. 1 year later, May stood in front of a mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Gone was the scared girl from the alley behind La Cirque. Instead, she saw a confident young woman in a simple but elegant blue dress, her hair neatly styled. Behind her reflection, she could see the bustling preparations for the opening ceremony of the Hamilton Youth Foundation. "Are you ready?" Mr. Hamilton asked, appearing in the doorway. He'd become more than just her guardian over the past year, he'd become family. "There are quite a few people out there waiting to hear your story." May took a deep breath, smoothing down her dress one last time. "Did you ever think, that night at the restaurant, that we'd end up here?" He chuckled, adjusting his tie. "You mean, did I think the homeless girl who saved my life would help us bring down an international crime ring, become my adopted daughter, and inspire a foundation to help other struggling kids? Can't say that was my first thought, no. The investigation had revealed more than anyone expected. Mrs. Hamilton's organization had been targeting brilliant minds across the globe for years, stealing innovations that could have changed the world for the better. Instead, they'd sold them to the highest bidders, not caring who got hurt in the process. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the power of simple human kindness. They hadn't counted on a homeless girl who still cared enough to help a stranger, even when the world had given her every reason not to care anymore. The reporters want to talk about the dramatic parts, May said, walking with Mr. Hamilton toward the conference room. The poison, the break-in, the arrest. But that's not really what matters, is it? What matters? He asked, though his smile suggested he already knew her answer. The little things, paying attention, caring about other people. Mai paused as they reached the door to the conference room. Everything changed because I noticed something wrong and decided to speak up. Anyone could have done that. Everyone should do that. The conference room was packed with people, reporters, business leaders, and most importantly, the first group of teens who would benefit from the Foundation's programs. Mai saw herself in their faces, the worry, the hope, the determination to make something better of their lives. Mr. Hamilton stepped up to the podium first. A year ago, he began. I was a man who thought he had everything figured out. I ran a successful company, lived in a fancy penthouse, and believed I could solve any problem with enough money or technology. He smiled at Mai. I was wrong about a lot of things. The most important things in life aren't the ones you can buy or invent. They're the connections we make with other people, the moments when we choose to help instead of look away. When it was May's turn to speak, she felt surprisingly calm. These weren't just strangers in fancy clothes. These were people who needed to hear what she had learned. People often ask me how I spotted the poison plot, she began. The truth is, living on the streets taught me to notice things others might miss. When you have nothing, you learn to pay attention to everything. But that's not the real lesson here. She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with the teens in the front row. The real lesson is that everyone has the power to make a difference. You don't need money or status or special training. You just need to be willing to see what's happening around you and have the courage to speak up when something's wrong. May explained how the foundation would work, providing not just shelter and education, but teaching young people to use their unique perspectives to help others. Some would train with security firms, turning their street smarts into professional skills. Others would work with community organizations, using their experiences to help more kids escape poverty. The woman who tried to kill my father thought she was strong because she could trick people, because she could take what she wanted without caring who got hurt, Mai continued. But real strength isn't about taking, it's about giving. It's about seeing someone in trouble and deciding to help, even when it's scary or inconvenient. She told them about the programs they were starting, self-defense classes, observation skills workshops, community outreach initiatives. But most importantly, she said, we're creating a network of people who look out for each other. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is for one person to pay attention at the right moment. The applause was thunderous when she finished, but Mai barely heard it. She was watching the faces of the teens in the front row, seeing hope replace doubt, seeing them sit up straighter, seeing them realize their own worth. Afterward, as people mingled and chatted, one of the young girls approached Mai. Were you scared? She asked quietly. That night in the restaurant, when you had to speak up. Mai thought about it. Terrified, she admitted. But being scared doesn't mean you're weak. Sometimes being scared and doing the right thing anyway is the bravest thing you can do. The girl nodded, understanding in her eyes. I want to learn to be brave like that. You already are, Mai told her. You're here, aren't you? You're trying to make your life better. That takes courage too. As the evening wound down, Mai found herself back with Mr. Hamilton, watching the sunset through the conference room windows. You know, he said, when I was building my company, I thought I was creating something that would change the world. But this, he gestured to the room full of hopeful young faces, this is how you really change the world. One person at a time, one act of kindness at a time. Mai leaned against his shoulder, feeling truly at home. The best security system in the world, she said with a smile, is people caring about each other. And she was right. Because in the end, the greatest power we have isn't in our technology or our wealth or our status. It's in our humanity, in our ability to see each other, to care about each other, and to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can create the biggest change. All we have to do is pay attention and have the courage to act.